I'd like to just start actually just by asking you to introduce yourself and talk about this piece of work that you've done and how that came apart, how that came about.
Right. Okay. So it can be very long introduction or very short, very brief introduction. Let's find a middle ground. Well, I started my career in banking a long time ago, but after about 10 years, I shifted to coaching. Mm-hmm. I've been coaching for about 5 years now, on one-to-one and group-wise. And at some point, I decided that I wanted to enhance that knowledge and take a master's degree in organizational psychology, and have been doing that degree for the last 2 years at UCL. And for obvious reasons, because I'm a coach, I thought that it would be a fair choice to do my dissertation on a coaching related topic versus other things like culture or gender equality or things like that. And it's been a real journey because coaching can be analyzed from many different perspectives. And there is not as much research on it actually as I thought initially. I thought it was a subject that has a vast and kind of had matured, let's say, in its research, but actually it's not. So research lags behind practitioners. Practitioners very much believe in coaching and they go and do a great job and they help people, but research backing that up has been lagging behind, and finding the gap on what would add an extra layer to the research, I realized that actually there's even less research on the channel used to coach, whether it's face-to-face or by telephone or online or any other channel, has any effect on how good the coaching process is. So that's how it came about, and that's why I chose to do my dissertation on the effectiveness of online coaching within the context of face-to-face coaching.
And clearly, the timing in terms of COVID was a very interesting time to assess the impact of online versus offline. And the other thing is just, you're absolutely right. It's really interesting the amount of coaching research that there has been that's very dated. An awful lot of the books that I read are from the 50s, the 60s and the 70s. So did you find that you were starting with a completely blank slate when you started your research?
I wouldn't say a blank blank slate, because it's true that coaching, the word coach has actually, going back to the word coach, it comes from the 1500s, where people would take in carriages someone from a place to somewhere else. So actually the concept of coach was taking a valuable person from one space to the next place, right? Now they don't use the word coach in that sense. The word has evolved in different ways, not taking physically someone from one place to another. It's taking them, mentally from one place to another. So the research started long ago, but it stopped in the 50s somehow. And there was it was put on hold, let's say, for about 40, 50 years. And in the 2000s, again, somehow it picked up researchers' attention, purely because there was a high demand in organizations. So organizations were demanding the service, practitioners were practicing the coaching, whereas research was not putting that much attention to it until the 2000s. They realized, oh, there's a trend. Actually, this is one of the things that organizations are spending more money on. And so it's not really a complete blank place, because there has been some research, but research is scarce. There's not as many meta-analyses and as many empirical studies as in other subjects psychologically related, if that makes sense. Did I answer your question, or did I go sideways?
That's brilliant and very useful. So obviously there are two parts to this for you. One is, as a coach, it's really interesting to see what people are doing, and also as a piece of research, it's interesting to gather that. What did you learn from the experience? What were your insights?
Oh, that's a very long question to that's a very open question. I learned a lot, and you said one thing before, which was about the timing. Obviously, the timing was something that affected the research. Firstly, maybe I chose to this topic because of the timing of COVID. Everyone went online, but at the same time, it didn't help when I was actually doing the research, because there wasn't a great deal of, let's say, overlap of that's what I felt, of what is coaching online and what is coaching online whilst being locked down and restricted. So a lot of as many of my interviews expressed, the conversations during lockdown changed, but not because the coaching was online, but because life had changed. So first of all, what I learned is that, yes, COVID had affected people's life way more than, people express generally, and it's felt. But also what I learned is that a lot of the things depend on the coach specifically. So you would have questions that I would have expected everyone to answer in a certain way, and then I would have completely different answers, or half and half. And you would go to the background of the coach, or the type of clients they have, and you would realize that actually it's a very, as they say, it's a personalized thing. Coaching is a very one-to-one, tailor-made. Well, that's how it should be. It's tailor-made coaching. It's not a one-to-all approach, which means that really studying coaching can be also difficult, because yes, you can make trends and you can come to certain conclusions for certain things, but there are things that depend on the coach and on the coaches, such as, for example, I'll bring a couple of examples. One thing I realized is many coaches, they would complain about the technology when coaching online. And at some point I felt there was a generation thing, that the younger coaches would not complain, the more, let's say, senior coaches would complain. But then I was like, oh, but there are exceptions to this rule. It's not just about age. And when I was analyzing, I realized it was not age at all. Well, age relates to that, but it was about computer literacy. So those coaches who were very experienced on online softwares and using online, or had been coaching online for a long time already, they were totally fine with online setup. Those coaches who just started with COVID and maybe computer was not their best friend, they really struggled, and they would get very nervous if the mic would go off, or this would happen, or that would happen, and of course that affects the coaching process altogether. So this is linking to what I'm saying. It depends on the coach and depends on the coaches. The same with the coaches. If your coaches struggle with computers, maybe they will be more tense when being coached online, as opposed to if they're fine, if they've been using and working with computers for a long time. So that's one of the things I learned, that's kind of, it really depends on the coach and the coachee, and coachees need to choose the right coach for their needs. If that makes sense.
It does. And it's really interesting what you say about how the technology affects the conversation, because as if either is nervous of the technology, that inevitably will affect the conversation. But there's also that thing about presence, okay? Perhaps you and me would have a different type of conversation if we were literally sat side by side over a coffee, compared to sort of connected through the internet. I mean, was your research able to differentiate the changes that happen because of technology and the changes that happen because of almost the circumstance?
So the circle size, you mean the presence? That's how I understand. So yes, there were lots of actually quite a few takeaways from that perspective. First, and so many things affect the presence. So for some, again, it's good online, and for some it's better face to face. So what research says, and what I could also conclude from the interviews that I conducted, is first of all, the personality of the person has a great deal in that. Specifically, the introversion and extroversion of the client and the coach, I would say. So there's more research on the client in this respect than on the coach. But introverts are more comfortable online, and they open up more online. Whereas for an extrovert, the online setup is just not the same. They would definitely, obviously, for obvious reasons, prefer a face-to-face setup. So there is pros and cons for both things. Then the other thing that affects is distractions came a lot. So some people felt more distracted online, and other people felt more distracted face-to-face, which was very funny, because people would come up with comments that made sense for either, the arguments that made sense for either side. So people who felt that online was more distracting, of course there were kids, cats, and animals, and the washing machine running next to you, and all those things were distractive. Whereas other people felt that online is way more focused, because you just tune in, you talk about what you have to speak, and that's it. And there's no distractions. There's no one breaking into your room, no one asking for help in the middle of the office or whatever. What people mentioned a lot, and I think it was a vast kind of consensus on this, is that online it became more streamlined, the sessions. It became a bit more business-like sessions. So all the part of let's grab a coffee, let's find a chair or a table where to sit on, all that rapport building aspect kind of vanished. So what I found is that maybe for the coachee, the end result was the same, but for the coach, it was way more effort to create that rapport. That's how people felt, that they had to find other ways to compensate for that part of rapport building which was lost, for that body language that you can read face-to-face, which you can't online. So you really have to work more on your probing questions, which made it a bit more difficult or more energy draining, let's say, for coaches. So I think, rather than I think, what I found is that in terms of effectiveness, most coaches found that online coaching was equally effective. But again, most coaches would prefer the face-to-face setting because it was more enjoyable. So two different, depends what you're looking for, a more enjoyable session or effectiveness.
It's really interesting you say about the rapport bit, and also about the fact that introverts may feel that they can open up more online because there's a sort of possibly a distance that makes them feel slightly protected. Because of course, rapport will very often affect content. How comfortable you feel with somebody will then have an impact on the nature of the conversation and what gets covered. Was there anything that you could draw on? Because you've touched on really interestingly about the rapport side. And I imagine the content probably was quite a lot about COVID, given the period. But did you get any feel for how the content of conversations had changed as a result of going online, or was it really more as a result of COVID, or is it very difficult to tell?
So that was one of the limitations. That's a great question, actually. And that was one of the limitations of the research, as I was mentioning before, that the fact that research was done when people had been working from home for the last 15 months. So that had a toll on people's mental health, of course. Even if you're mentally healthy, it still has a toll on your mental health. So there was, all my interviews expressed there was a change of conversation. But the way I felt and I understood it is that most of the time, the change of the conversation was because of the COVID. Whether that some change would have happened if we were not in COVID, that's a question mark, and I would suggest for similar research to be done when we're free of any kind of pandemic restrictions. However, I did have people who have had coached online previously, or maybe not online, but a couple of comments that I had is that people had coached people, coaches outside of their office environments. So in a coffee shop or in their offices, and they would perceive difference of conversation when they were coaching someone inside the office where the client works or outside of the office. And the perception, the specific feeling they had is that inside the office, the clients, coaches felt that, we have to talk about these topics. Anything other than that is like, hold on, I can't talk about that because we are at work and that topic doesn't belong to my workplace. Whereas when they were in a pub or somewhere else or in a hotel or whatever, kind of that wall disappeared. They were not in the office and all of a sudden they could talk about other type of feelings and perceptions that were not just that project related or that how can I talk better in meetings or things like that, if that makes sense. So I would presume that online would have a different conversation as well compared to if you're in the building of your workplace.
And previously you touched on the fact that having interviewed a number of coaches, you've learned something from those coaches themselves, not just about the content and the medium and being online, but actually from the coaches and their coaching techniques. I mean, what are the things that you have learned from that experience that you would use going forwards?
I think one of the takeaways for me is that, well, there were quite a few, but one of the takeaways is that you really need to analyze. Let's go one step back, and is that there's no one for all approach. So I would ask, one of the questions I would ask people is, what kind of framework do you use? What kind of process and framework do you use? And different coaches would come up with different frameworks. Grow was a common one. People would mention, but I think that before, for example, so as a coach, you should not go around thinking, okay, I'm going to start with Grow and then I'm going to do this. So you can't really design something that would fit everyone. You really have to focus on that first intake session, understand what the client needs. So which of your frameworks, exercises, tools you should be using. You can't go with your tools, already haven't chosen your tools without knowing the customer, because they might need something slightly different. So having an array of tools and being flexible to adapt to the client is really important. So one of the things that I came across in my research is you will probably know that coaching is a non-regulated industry. So anyone can basically be a coach. But however, there is a danger in that non-regulated space, because coaching can touch very deep psychological aspects of people. And the more the coach knows about psychology and depending on what kind of coach it is, I'm talking from the perspective of career and organizational coaching. So the more the coach has knowledge of psychology and organizational and business setups, the better equipped the coach will be, and the better tools they will have to come and ask, more, let's say, deeper questions. because otherwise you might actually do more harm than good as a coach. If you don't know what you're doing, you might end up touching a point that is very sensible in a person and not be able to sort that out. So I think it's key. What I learned is that it's key for coaches to really be equipped with as many tools and techniques and psychological knowledge as they can, and business knowledge if they're doing career coaching, as they possibly can. That will really help them to be better at serving their clients.
And one of the things that's really interesting is the fact that, you know, so many post-COVID, and hopefully we can say we are post-COVID, even if we're at the tail end of it. Okay, you know, there's now this huge debate about working from home, and will we all go back to work, or has the world changed fundamentally and forever? What was the response that you got in terms of how people see coaching going forwards? Do some people want to revert back? Do some people say this is a permanent shift? And if it's a permanent shift, who felt that this was a great way forward and who was a little bit more reserved?
That's a really great question. And actually, it was one of the suggestions I put in my paper for future research. Because I have my personal view on this, and then of course there's the view of each coach out there. So I think going forward, post-pandemic, working from home is not going to be the same as working from home when you're in a pandemic, which means that your kids will be at school, you will have other leisure activities to go to, you will not be homebound prisoner in a way. So perception of working from home and being coached from home will change. It will not be, you know, I'm stuck here because I'm forced to be here. What I felt, or what I suspect, I have so many ideas that I start a sentence and I'm like, oh, I should say this before, so it makes sense. There is a research, there's a meta-analysis, a really good one by Jones, that he compared, or he looked at research that was comparing face-to-face coaching with blended coaching. So blended meaning face-to-face mixing with online or telephone coaching. And he found that there was no difference in effectiveness. He thought before the study that there would be a difference, but during the study he found there was no difference. My study was slightly different. It was comparing face-to-face to online. So the blended was kind of not there. And I think the piece that is missing is comparing blended sessions with online sessions, which would then, you know, make the chain of of all the comparisons. What I felt people were feeling is that coaches who had, so at the beginning of the pandemic, there were still clients that you had a session with online, sorry, face-to-face, and then you went online, and then people, you know, clients started being just online, right? So people felt that those clients, that they had at least one session face-to-face, and then everything was online. So the rapport and engagement online was as good as when it was face-to-face, because probably they had already had that rapport session building at the beginning. And what many coaches expressed is that, you know, they suddenly learned online that they don't have to travel, they don't have to spend half a day going back and forth to one office space. That saves them a lot of time. They can book more hours of coaching, because now not necessarily back to back, because you still need some relaxed time in between sessions, but all of a sudden they found that they have this flexibility and time gifted to them. So going, or even flying, I used to fly to France to do sessions, and even all that time is suddenly saved. So going back completely to the face-to-face was like, oh, seriously? Do we have to do that? Now that I got used to this, it's okay. I'm fine with asking more probing questions to get that rapport building. I'll do that. So I think what people would appreciate, both coaches and coachees, is to have a mix of sessions, like having maybe your initial intake or initial rapport building face-to-face, or a couple of sessions face-to-face, and then go online. And I feel, this is not covered in my research, but I feel this would be way more effective, or at least as effective as any other type of coaching, because you would have created that rapport, you would have read that body language, you would get to know the person, they would get to know you in a way, and probably that would make up for the loss of, maybe not the entire body language loss, because I mean, still it's present, you have to be present to see certain things, but I think that's the way forward.
Picking up on the body language thing, so one of the things that I personally find an interesting challenge is the difference between looking at you, I'm now looking at you, okay, on the screen, okay, and looking at the camera, which means that I actually lose some of that body language, but hopefully maintain eye contact, which is valuable for the customer. I mean, did you have any sort of thought on that in your research, or frankly, in your own experience, having done so many Zoom calls? How does the eye contact balance with the body language?
So that's again a very, very great question, very interesting question, and I did touch on that very lightly on my research. Eye contact is part of body language. So when we're coaching online, right now you can just see up to my neck, but you can't see anything else. So you really don't see my hand movements. I might do gestures which would emphasize certain words or certain sentences that I'm saying, and all that is not visible, but we still have podcasts, and they're great and amazing, and people listen to them. So body language is fantastic. It's not everything, but it's a lot, right? Especially for coaching. So one thing is listening to a podcast, another thing is coaching someone, where you have to really use that active listening skills. But active listening, as some coaches say, this is funny, because some coaches would say, well, the word itself says listening, so it's about listening. But some other coaches would say, well, my listening is not just about my ears. I will use my eyes to see how the person moves, and whether they're tapping their feet and this and that. So online, you of course have some body language visuals. You see the face, you see the eyes, but I just say you can really never make up an eye contact as you would face-to-face, because of the camera and the screen set up in all computers, or most computers, as far as I'm aware about computers. So you can never really make up that eye contact. And there is research saying that if you're looking at someone in their eyes, that is perceived as an interest in what they're saying. And if you are avoiding looking at someone, that is perceived as the person is not interested, is disinterested in what you're saying. And that's not exactly the message you want to send when you're coaching someone, that you're not interested. So you try to look at the camera, but then you're actually not seeing them at all. So that's a very interesting point, and I can't really put a number from 1 to 10 how much that affects a session. But I think it does have certain impact also, because, for example, I can't look at the camera. I can't talk like that. I end up looking at the person. And I'm aware that then they feel that I'm not looking at them. But that must have an effect. But to be honest, I did not calculate, so I did not stress on how much that affects. But certainly body language from all the coaches that I interviewed, I think everyone expressed that, reading body language was just not the same as online.
And one of the things that we've now discovered about how Zoom works is that people suffer genuine Zoom fatigue, because of course you and I are in very close proximity, possibly closer than we would be if we were sat having coffee. Yeah. And back-to-back Zoom meetings. I imagine, did that come across as a factor for coaches? Probably more for coaches that may have multiple sessions in a day than for coachees or clients. But was there any mention of Zoom fatigue?
rather than the word of Zoom fatigue, what came up is, well, something very similar, which would be a synonym, let's say, of Zoom fatigue. Is, you know, when your life is on face to face, you will work on your computer. You will then go and grab a coffee, chat with someone face to face, and then we'll come and pick up the phone and talk to someone, and then we'll have a face-to-face meeting, and we'll come back to your computer. We'll continue working with your computer. You may have a video call, but when you're working from home solely, all you see is that screen, those edges. Yes, the background inside the screen changes, the people going across your screen change, but all you'll see is the same thing all day, and that can be tiring. That can be very tiring because you're typing on your computer, you're speaking on your computer, then you're typing on your computer, you're checking your emails on your computer. So you're looking at the same thing all day long, and that can be very tiring. The other thing that came about, which is slightly different to what you said, but it links with when you said multiple meetings, is that when you're working online, people tend to book meetings back to back. And some coaches do that too. And we all know that coaching is not just another meeting. You have to go there a bit, you know, in getting in the zone before going into your session, because it's a different type of conversation. It's not a strategy meeting. It's not about deciding an action plan or this and that. It's more, well, yeah, it is deciding an action plan, but it's a different way of coming to that action plan. So people would come to the Zoom meeting like almost, you know, hanging up one call and dialing into the next one in a, as I said before, in a business-like mind. So they would not allow that time to cool down and come to the session, which means that the coach has to take an extra time to cool you down. Well, what I heard from some coaches is like, they would be like, okay, why don't you take 10 minutes, go and grab a coffee and come back, because you're a bit too agitated right now. What would be advisable is for both coaches and coaches is to really make sure you have that, at least those 15 minutes in between calls, so you can, you know, disconnect from the previous conversation because you're going into a new conversation. Whereas face-to-face, because even if you just have to go to a different floor, go and find the meeting room or go to the cafeteria downstairs, you already have those 10 minutes that's kind of, in a way, make you think, okay, what is it that I'm going to talk about during this coaching session? What was this about? So it gets you kind of in the zone of getting into that session. So this was slightly disconnected from what you said, but when you mentioned back-to-back meetings, I thought it was worth commenting on it.
I mean, what are the other pieces of advice that you might give coaches or clients, particularly as online seems now increasingly to be the way to go?
So I think going back to one of the first things that I mentioned is, you know, we coaches have lots of continuous development programs, and it's advised for us to, you know, continue to develop ourselves. So one of the things that I would suggest to look whether it's worth including in these things is actually for coaches to getting used to certain setups and softwares. I'm not saying that everyone should go and become a IT specialist, but we need to make sure that this fear of working online is gone, that we overcome it. And it's everything is about practice, right? As I mentioned, those coaches who had already been working online for a long time, I didn't feel at all that they had any kind of hesitation. Those coaches who were new, they suffered at the beginning. And what some of them mentioned is that they suffered at the beginning, but now they're fine. So making sure that people know how to use really well certain softwares and video calling systems. Some coaches who had really, let's say, good IT skills, they would even incorporate on-the-spot transcriptions. They would show me like they have several screens, like it was like a studio there or something like that. So, so of course that puts the client and the entire environment at ease, right? Some coaches would express me how now doing trainings online would be much easier for them, because they could have their notes, they could have this and that, and they would use these extra resources that you can't use face to face. So why not learn about all those things? Why not all of us become experts in crafting our, what we need to know? So I think that would be one of my suggestions for coaches. Instead of panicking or avoiding the future, because that's the future, is actually why don't we embrace it? Why don't we include certain types of programs like this in continuous development programs? I think that's one of the things that I would suggest. The other thing is for coaches to try and be open to those blended sessions. I think that will really enhance the experience, because sometimes what I felt is that also coaches were expressing is now there's no geographical limitation. You don't have to coach just the person who is living in your city or the city next to yours, which is reasonably makes sense to travel to. But now you can coach someone who is on the other side of the world. And as some of my interviewees said, is that closing yourself to online coaching means that you're doing a disservice to all the people you could be coaching who are on the other side of the world. So why not embrace that? But if it's possible, if they're in proximity, maybe we can do that blended session and have one face-to-face and then go to a more time-saving mode of doing blended sessions. I mean, this is just an assumption, right? Because body language and communication is a big part of our communication. I think it's up, some people say up to 90, but some people say from 60 to somewhere 90% of our communication is actually non-verbal, is through our body. However, what I learned is that one of the things that came up, this is very interesting, is that those coaches who would have done telephone coaching or without the video, they would find the experience way more, not rewarding is not the word, but they felt that their listening, the attention they were able to put to the listening skills as we define it in coaching, were elevated to really the next level, because inevitably you have to shut down all the other senses. You can't see, you can't smell, you can't feel, so you really have to listen, and you have to learn all those very minor signs of your clients, in changes in their tonality, changes in their voices. And I think actually this is something really great, because coaching is about listening. It's not about listening and sensing and sipping your coffee and yes, you can have a bit of fun and this and that, everything adds to it. But really, instead of complaining, saying, okay, I'm going to try to use this time and this type of sessions to really enhance my listening skills. Let's see, what is it that I'm learning as a coach when I'm purely listening, as opposed to when I'm listening, seeing and smelling and all those things. So I think that could be a very much of a learning experience for many coaches, and it would add to their professionalism. Let's put it that way.
I think the other thing that's just interesting in terms of Zoom calls or Teams or whatever vehicle you're using is people's backgrounds. Now, I might not be a good example, but after a period, I decided to adopt a very plain, and you can see right now I'm using a sort of brick wall background, because I thought it was really, really, really neutral. Because I can see that sometimes backgrounds could be really engaging or possibly quite distracting. I mean, what was your experience having done so many sessions with so many people with so many backgrounds? And of course, the joke nowadays is everyone has bookshelves, loads and loads of books, and we all look at the books.
That's an interesting question. I did not have, I remember you mentioned about that in the interview, but I did not have many more comments on the backgrounds. I had more comments about, you know, the cat crossing across the screen, or someone's kids coming around, and of course that's distracting, but not necessarily about the background. Maybe because my questions were not framed in that way, so it did not prompt people to comment on that. So I can't really comment on that, I'm afraid.
But from your own experience, did you find yourself looking at people's backgrounds?
I've done a lot of coaching, not just for the interviews, and I have to say that yes, you do spend you can at times get a bit distracted by someone's background. I've had like really messy backgrounds with some clients, or even when they put a screen. Sometimes they put some very funny or very bright or very, very whatever, and you're like, oh, that yellow is cool, and you can get distracted. But I don't know whether you get more distracted than in a face-to-face environment where, you know, a coat might fall off, or someone might sneeze next on the table next to you. There was only one occasion that I was coaching someone a year ago that her background was, like, as I said, extremely messy, full of clothes, and the clothes were coming out of the wardrobe, and I was like, oh my God, this is very distracting. But yeah, I'm not sure personally if other backgrounds that I've seen has been more distracting, the coffee machine behind in the bar, or something else happening in the room.
What's next for you?
That's a good question. Well, so in September I will be continuing with my coaching sessions at a university that I coach, and just continuing with my business of coaching. I really enjoy the business and executive and leadership coaching. The conversations for me are much more fulfilling than any other type of coaching, probably because of my own background. So just working hard on my clients, on my sessions, and trying to serve my clients as best as I can.
And if people want to get in contact with you, how should they do that?
So I have a website called www.fittingskills.com. So fittingskills.com altogether. And they can reach out through the website, and that will come straight to my email, and I will see them. They can also contact me via LinkedIn. My name is Lusine Magakian, and happy to have a chat with anyone who needs some career advice.